everybody, and welcome back to Dan's Astrology. The other day I was doing a video on Saturn in Pisces, which is just station retrograde and will be in a square to Jupiter over the summer. And I, admittedly some of my videos go in a certain direction, some may go in another direction. And one of the things, there's certain ideas that I've been getting from books that I have been using, journaling, writing, and I've just been marinating with them for a while. And what I'm going to do is to try to, I've already made a video about, Saturn stationing retrograde, but there's another idea that I had that I didn't quite get into that I felt was relevant to this. And I'm going to at least record this to try to just play around with it and see what happens. And the idea is basically that there's a certain kind of language or rhetoric that goes with the New Age in general. And I've noticed, there's often a trend of people who might be self-taught, New Agers who are just sort of trying to express whatever trip they're on or whatever, right? And I'm not necessarily saying, then that can be contrasted with something that's part of a more of a discipline in terms of being part of academic institution or having a history of thinkers or something, or somebody could just be coming up with stuff, right? But there are nonetheless certain ideas which, if you're doing something in a space which is kind of New Age, that people kind of just use ideas, and the ideas reference kind of big things, but they're kind of it's not necessarily something that you may have come up with yourself, but you are participating, whether you could be kind of naively participating in a big conversation that is unrelated, or there could also be the certain avenues which, if you're only participating in a certain online space, things kind of get taken in a certain direction. But if you avoid that and go in other directions, there's interesting things that open up that are that may. Anyway, so this is one of the things that I have been playing with, is that I don't necessarily know where I fit in or where I belong, but I can, at least by not being so involved in certain areas which have gotten kind of dense. We got a whole bunch of people participating and a whole bunch of people doing the same thing, that you can kind of see that there's other kind of pathways or avenues in which to take things. And one of the examples of that is to do with this whole idea of individuality, autonomy, sovereignty, agency, and the idea of fragmentation, division, that kind of stuff, right? And I think this is often something that is brought up in terms of a Jungian perspective, where there's a kind of a fragmented ego, different parts that are in conflict with each other, inner fragmentations, and that they're healing. Apparently the etymology of healing is a movement towards wholeness. That's the word health is related to the word whole. That's where it comes from. And I think it's if you think about it in terms of if somebody falls sick and they're bedridden or something, then they're not living their whole life, because it's part of what their total life is has been removed from them. Or if you, let's say you break your arm and you can't use your arm and you have limited functioning, healing is regaining the wholeness of your total functioning, right? But that's still kind of there's something interesting about this, because that is the wholeness of your functioning in respect to what you are able to do, and but not every people may be specialized, right? You can't really regain something that you never had in the first place. So healing is always a kind of like, there's a wholeness that is like a pre-existing wholeness, and then there's a wholeness that you need to develop by growing, right? And so the idea that, and but like growth is not the same as healing. Healing is more of like recovery. Healing is more of like recovering something, whereas growing and expanding, this is, which is, growing and expanding is interesting, because if you may have something which you consider whole, and then there may be something which exists outside of that, which where we get into this question of like, there are you have this thing which is healthy, which is whole, which has all these, the fragmented parts are now in better communication with each other, even if, or whatever, right? Or there's the idea of things which may be opportunities for growth and expansion that have previously been unavailable. And I think if we're looking at the human evolution, or human, so even as just development as a new technology, and so there's all sorts of avenues of ways to grow and expand and do new things. But then there's this question of what is healthy, and there's this question of what belongs to the whole, right? Now, if you consider this from the point of view of time, right, that something like, let's say, you take any kind of technology, like a steam engine or a train or something like that, or an automobile. These are all things that, in the span of life on Earth, these things have not been around for very long, right? In the span of human civilization, these things have not been around for very long. So there's a question of healing as a recovery of wholeness, and also the emergence of new things onto the scene, and where do they fit into it, and what happens when new things that emerge into the scene have a negative effect on making us ill, or disrupting or damaging, that kind of stuff, right? There's the idea that we may grow and expand in different directions. But there's this kind of idea that, like, what if the train, the steam engine, was always there as a possibility, like a blueprint within the mind of God? You could put it like that, right? If you're an idealist, there's this idea that there may be a kind of, if you take the direction of Platonic idealism and perfect forms and ideas, that there's some sort of thing called eternity, and in eternity, everything that has always existed, or everything that could possibly exist from the past to the future, is somehow there in virtual form. In the same way that there are many trains, many different types of cars, many different ways to build a home, there's some blueprint that a archetypal car that precedes all cars, some archetypal train that precedes all trains, some archetypal boat that precedes all boats, and that these forms exist prior to the manifestation of all the forms that we see in life, right? So there's this idea that the train and the car were always there. It just took humankind a long time to get there, to realize, or they could say that the car was imminent as a potentiality in the chariot, right? If you take it all the way back to ancient times, as soon as we invented wheels, and as soon as we figured we could set these wheels up in relation to horses and had chariots to ride around on, you basically had the archetype of the car was there in the chariot, and you may often see that kind of iconography played upon with marketing, the way that, Mustangs, or whatever, you still have the horse imagery or something like that, right? So there's a certain thing. There could be even that modern technology could be expression of an eternal form that in the linear time path was able to express itself as a chariot, but over time that we have basically a situation of novelty in that the technological advancement has created new things to emerge which previously were not there before. And there is the question about wholeness, right? That if wholeness, in terms of being wholeness of future and past and present and all eternity and all things that could be made and all things that are, or all things that could be, all things that could not, that will not be, but could be a possibility virtually, exist in this sort of state of wholeness. You're obviously not going to choose all the options all at once, right? You're obviously going to like go a certain path, and health obviously has some degree of limiting what the options are to what is good for human beings, right? Because I mean, health is all like basically relative, right? Because there could be things that you could do that are healthy for you, that are not healthy for other parties, or affect the environment not very well. But there's some kind of thing. I think that health, from the human point of view, is obviously related to what is good for the individual, right? And there's part of the individual is if we're talking in the context of we are all individual human beings, there is a what makes you an individual versus the idea that I have come across called the Dividual, which I have recently read this book called Dividuum by Gerald, Raunig, and I've also, the Deleuze and Guattari talk about this too, and this is kind of based off that stuff. But I don't know if there might be other people who've talked about the Dividual, as opposed to the individual, right? And so that when I'm getting back to this whole thing where I started, was I was talking about wholeness, healing, the idea of, and fragmentation, right? And this is, I haven't even talked very much about the astrology, but I'm interested in astrology in this context because of the idea of Jupiter in Gemini and Saturn in Pisces being mutable signs. And there's this kind of movement when you go from cardinal to fixed to mutable, where cardinal is usually a single figure, like the ram, like the crab, the goat, the goat horned one, our Dark Lord, the goat horned one, and what's the other one? Well, actually, the Libra is the scales. So there's a kind of a two thing going on with Libra, right? So Libra's actually, I mean, we're not going to get into all this kind of stuff. But Cardinal has this basically like setting forth a more singular thing, and then fixed is like sustaining that, and then the next one is the mutable, which is basically releasing that into change, into multiplicity, into a dynamic, like rather than having a singular thing that you just hold to, the mutable is letting go and releasing into a kind of a more of a multiplicity, right? And the idea often when it comes to the conversation around the movement towards wholeness and the movement towards what is healthy, and is that I'm not saying this is the right way to interpret it. I'm just playing around with ideas. But there's this sort of it could be a criticism, anyways, or something that you can see by playing with astrology. Because there's something about the mutable signs. I don't think the mutable signs are fundamentally sick or flawed or deranged because they're mutable. Although I think it is true that maybe there is a reason why Gemini sometimes gets a bad rap, why Pisces gets a bad rap, why Sagittarius gets a bad rap. You know, there could be problems that go with the mutable signs, right? And in contrast to that, the cardinals are seen as, you know, like hitting the drum, a distinctive thwack or whatever, right? To make a sound. And then the fixed sign is like holding to that sound, sustaining it. Like if you're playing guitar and you have a sustain pedal and you hit the note and it rings out for a long time, right? That's kind of like, and then the mutability is, there's some sort of Jungian fear of letting go to the forces of chaos, basically, right? And there's something about reading stuff, contrasting the approach of Jungians to reading stuff like Deleuze and Guattari, because obviously Guattari was a guy who wrote about stuff like chaosmosis or chaosophy. Guattari was very much more a kind of guy who is in favor of taking the chaotic approach. In contrast, I think that what has happened in the times post-corona, post-pandemic, or there's been a kind of a conservative reactionary force against a perceived chaos and unpredictability of the future, basically, and a kind of what Deleuze and Guattari talked about, falling back onto structures that provide a sense of security. And this is most typically evident in anybody who's familiar with the man who popularized Deleuzian theory, Deleuze-Guattarian approach, Nick Land, was a guy who basically went into a paranoid reaction towards Christian conservatism because it seemed to be a bastion of security in the face of a terrifyingly chaotic and unpredictable cosmos that had been given itself, like basically given instead of having a kind of a monarchical, or this whole thing about the structures of monarchy and papacy and the priesthood and having these structures of society that were giving itself over to a very chaotic capitalist society where it's kind of like the big fish eat the little ones. Or like the way that Amazon is named after the Amazon jungle, in the way that it suggests that it's like the alpha predator and that it's like this big, it's like a big saber-toothed tiger and all your small businesses are like prey animals that it's just going to eat up, and because it's just the law of the jungle, right? There's like that kind of chaos. People basically... There is a group of people called Christian Accelerationists which have decided that like there's no stopping the forces of capitalist market economy, but that maybe by falling back upon traditional masculine structures, then that gives you some sort of footing to stand on in the face of that insecurity, one way or another, right? And the presumable thing is that if these forces demand you provide them with a lot of man-hour, a lot of labor or something, you will be able to be fully optimized in your health to know how to, you work out a lot and you take the right supplements and you're strong. So if Amazon wants to like really milk you for your manpower, you as a man will have the structures of the traditional patriarchal society to enable you to meet the challenge of survival in the Amazon jungle of like modern capitalism, basically, right? And to bring this back to the astrology, there's something about the dynamic between Saturn in Pisces and Jupiter in Gemini, where there is a question about, well, what am I trying to say? There's the question of fragmentation and healing, and the idea that there's some in the conversation where there's a tendency to go in this like Jungian direction of like recovering wholeness, because recovery is first of all recovering what has been lost. So if you consider your wholeness to be like the traditional like gender, like trad wife gender norms of like the wife stays at home with the kids in the kitchen and the man goes out and makes all the money, and this is our bulwark against the competitive forces of like the Amazon jungle of capitalism that is going to make us survive throughout it, then that is seen as like the rather if the forces of capitalism are instead challenging that in a way that you have to change in some... It's kind of like going to a poker game and putting your money on a certain hand, being like, I think I can win it with this one because this is the thing that has been like a source of security for mankind. Like I'm gonna bet that I can like win this game using this, because this is what gives me the idea of a strong father figure who's able to. It's like kind of, there's sentimentality there and familiarity, and I want to put my money on this rather than like radically transforming myself to somehow have a, like the way that Amazon or like streaming services destroyed like the VHS or something like that, the home video. Like there's like instead of like trying to like figure out how you're going to disrupt things and how you're going to like create some sort of new business model that like an invasive species or something, like instead of trying to be a weed that like takes over and proliferates, you're trying to figure out how to be something that is like the tree, which stands very strong and grows for like over lots of generations and doesn't really care if there are a bunch of bramble bushes growing around it invasively, right? But there's the question of like, if you have a tree and you have a whole bunch of like rhizomatic blackberry bushes that are just growing out of control, that basically take over the landscape aggressively, are those blackberry bushes, those bramble bushes, going to eventually choke out the tree by robbing it of sunlight and outcompeting it? And the problem here is like, is our pruning or weeding of the blackberry bushes taken to a kind of a point of like fascistic genocide against the rhizomatic proliferate? But the thing is, when the rhizomatic proliferation is some sort of like exploitative corporate thing, maybe you do want to go to war against that, right? Maybe that's not something, but there's this pressure that you have to emulate that if you want to be successful. That if that's the only way people are winning, then there's this pressure that you have to give up what you're doing to adapt to those people, right? And so where am I going with this? There is this pressure to adapt because of economic circumstances, and the bias that the healing or the healthy thing is to fall back upon some pre-existing structure, because that's going to give you the edge over the chaos of multiplicity. And the multiplicity being basically like Gemini and Pisces, and rather than being like the shark that eats the small fish, thinking about a multiplicity of fish, thinking about a whole ocean of different plants and animals and life forms, a whole multiplicity of different options, right? Rather, you have your thing that you use as a bulwark to fall back upon, this is how we've always done it. This is what gives us comfort and security. And then there is some demand that's put on you by society or by the economic situation that you need to change, you need to adapt, you need to evolve, or else you're going to get eaten by the lion, you're going to get eaten by the saber-toothed tiger, you're going to die in the jungle in a competitive, chaotic world that knows no mercy, because people are they've given up religion and they've given into the law of the jungle, which is like Charles Darwin, survival of the fittest, social Darwinism, the strong survive, the weak die or are killed by the Nazis, right? So that's basically where we're at. And as an astrologer, my responsibility being that I don't want to encourage you to be the guys who are like social Darwinists or Nazis that feel like you have to like aggressively eliminate all the people who are just parasitic waste on society, because out of fear that maybe you would feel that way about me, because I read too much books rather than working on serious like problems that need to be fixed, like the broken water main in Calgary, right? Like there's obviously going to be much more demand for civic engineers, plumbers, that kind of stuff than pretentious unemployed people who are overly literate and underemployed, right? Because it's draining on the economy. And so I have this kind of bias, basically, for my own self-interest, to be self-defensive against what I perceive as potential threats, and which has left me in a state of hypervigilance. And basically schizophrenic withdrawal from society. And so I'm just kind of like going full blast today in this video. Hopefully you guys like it. I'm letting her rip. I'm still, there's certain things that I haven't gone into yet. Like the whole idea also of autonomy and fragmentation. The idea that we live in a more fragmented society being a problem, like that we need to, we get into it. We need to heal society. There are wounds at the social level, wounds at the level of community, because there's a certain integrity that happens if a community has a sense of health and wholeness. There's a certain integrity of all members of the community. And unfortunately, there's this whole issue to do with cancel culture, and cancel culture relates to the exclusion of people from the community, which is a kind of basically a pastoralism, which is connected with disability. That usually disabled people are seen as there's something wrong with them, and they need to be. There's something that disabled people are often segregated and separated from society and neglected. And there's this sort of whole thing that exists prior to anything that I could come up with, where people think that somehow healing community, it will heal the social ills of society, and that will somehow affect things on the individual level, right? And the idea that but there's this problem about the fragmentation. There's a certain individuality that is obviously the individuality. Like, what does it mean when you have individuality on one hand and community on the other? Because obviously a community is comprised of individuals, right? And there's something about the individuality of the person, which means that the person is themselves has their own autonomy, their own sovereignty, their own right to themselves, that does not reduce down to whether they are included or excluded from any number of given communities, right? There could be a number of different, and so whether or not a person is part of the community or not, the person has their own autonomy, the person has their own individuality, but there are certain communal pressures which may influence a person to make, if the person has their own choice, their own sovereignty about how they live their lives, there's always the communal pressure of we're programmed to need to belong, basically programmed to need to be part of some kind of a group, and there's some kind of like sort of there's obviously the group has the right to set its own boundaries. The group has the right to set its own limits. The group has a right to gatekeep or whatever, maintain the borders or whatever is necessary, and that is part of just it's you may not like being on the outside of that, but it's a necessary thing of what defines community. And one of the good news, at least, is that there may not be just one community. There may not just be like one thing, but there may be a multiplicity of different communities. However, the same problem that happens in one community may repeat itself across different communities, because at a certain imminent level, there is things happening in a multiplicity, but then the idea of the archetypes is there are archetypal forms which precede the multiplicity, so that you have the patterns playing out across different communities in different ways, and the multiplicity at least gives you the potential, anyways, that if one thing says yes, the other one might say no, or that then not everything's going to be exactly the same. So there is there's some potential for diversity or that if people have the will to do something different, they have the opportunity to establish something different and get it, and it doesn't have to if you are excluded from one thing, you can always do something different that has a different set of rules. However, then it comes into the thing of being all included under the same plane of immanence that is the world, that is the manifestation, that is the common reality that we all deal with. And if your actions start to impinge on others in negative ways, then there is reason for whatever, like the pressure to do something that benefits the other people who have different perspectives or different beliefs or whatever, right? And then that gets us into the domain of a more global political situation where all parties are considered and stuff like that. But there's this whole fragmentation, right? They're not all just like, we're not having like, the problem is that, okay, so way back when I used to live in Vancouver, right? I used to have a little bit more of a connection to the, I'm not a kind of person who, I don't know. At some point in time, there were people that associated themselves as being like artists. And the thing about artists, of course, is that it's like one of the notoriously difficult ways to make money. And as the cost of living in Vancouver started to increase, the thing about most artists is they also have a certain visionary kind of way where they like to look at the future and see where things are going. And most artists saw the general trend that things were going, were able to project how things were going, and they decided that based on the fact that what they like to do is not very good for making money, and the fact that everything was going to be getting expensive, they basically got out of there. They vacated the area. But back when there were still artists and things weren't so expensive, there were people that you would meet, and these artists would like there's a certain conflict, right, that I associate in a simplified way with the basic tension between punks and hippies, right? And it tends to be like, this is a stereotype, but I think that the stereotype is usually that punks tend to go left and hippies tend to go right. However, there could also just be the other way around, where there are right-wing punks and left-wing hippies, but you don't see that represented in the media so much. But in the world of artists and punks and hippies, there is some kind of tension between the punks and the hippies, where the hippies, basically what happens is, like, if you're kind of person who likes meditating and yoga, and you go to India and you sacrifice your ego at the feet of a guru or something like that, the punks don't like this very much, because they see it as just like you're giving away your own individual autonomy, your own individuality. You're sacrificing that in the name of running away to another culture, and a male patriarchal authority figure generally is now the guy who is your daddy, who tells you what to do, and you've lost your own personal autonomy and integrity, right? Whereas the punks basically are more, there is a certain group herd thing where the punks may, all dress the same. They may start adopting certain their own dogmas of, like, this is what we believe in and what we don't believe in, and if you believe something else, we're going to, like, be mean to you, and because we don't just have studded spiky things on our vests for nothing. We're tough, right? And we're aggressive about what we believe in, and we think we're right and you're wrong, kind of thing, right? But the thing is, when you take this, what tends to happen, there's this problem with the left wing, that the left wing tends towards fragmentation, in the same way that there's the right-wing hippie who goes to India, who sublimates their ego to the guru, is there with a whole bunch of other people doing the same thing. They have more numbers, right? Because there's all these people who were individuals who thought they wanted to be boss, they wanted to have personal autonomy, they wanted to, and they went into this big crowd, and they surrendered themselves to the bliss of just surrendering to the masses, and some guru who knows better, he can solve it for you, and you give up your personal responsibility, right? The punks, on the other hand, think this is a lousy way to go. They think you got to keep your personal responsibility, you got to keep up your mind, you got to keep your opinions, and you got to, like, go to war. And the problem about this is that it turns out that there are inner divisions, right? And the left ends up, the left-wing punks end up fragmenting. This is also obvious. I'm just playing with stereotypes. The actual real world has more nuance than this, but just for the sake of communicating the idea, I'm using these simple stereotypes. But there is this problem that the left wing has a ongoing bad reputation towards fragmentation, because then it's prone to infighting, right? It's prone to infighting. It's prone to the narcissism of small differences. It's the problem about not being like the guys who go and give up your ego to surrender to the guru and keep your ego and work and try to work that out is it tends to be a bunch of people who are isolated and resentful and bitter and alone, and because they think that they're right and that they need to fight everybody else who thinks differently from them, and they don't tend to get along very well, and then they don't have the same kind of like they criticize the moral injunction to better oneself, which includes living a healthy life. To like, you're not going to be the boss of me and tell me that I can't smoke and drink, and then so it's like then you start feeding your bitterness and resentment with drugs and alcohol, and your self-destructive urges, or you become it's like this downward spiral where you think your ego and your political opinions matter, and you just don't agree with anybody, and you argue and you don't get along with anybody, and now the left is basically powerless. But the thing what's ironic though is that I'm in Canada, I'm on the West Coast. I mean, I don't want to jinx it, right? Knock on wood, but we have an NDP government here in British Columbia, and actually, despite the fact that there's a social fragmentation on the left, and there's like crazy lots of resentful people who don't get along with each other. There's also I think what I noticed, there's a tendency towards really bad. There's like there's studies have shown that people who identify as left wing are also more likely to identify as mentally ill, right? Now, it could also just be that right-wingers are more likely to be in denial of being mentally ill. You could very well be like way more crazy or way more mentally ill, but you just don't relate to that, and you instead try to accuse other people of being sick, right? Like, the world is fucked. Obviously, it's not me. And like, there's all these crazy people who like, rather than upholding traditional values, they just get a lot of piercings and tattoos, dye their hair funny colors. It's obviously they're the sick ones. So I don't have to blame. I don't have to. Obviously I'm okay, and we're a bastion of health and sanity in a world gone crazy, right? And so there's a tendency for right wingers to like point the finger and say this is why you shouldn't be left wing, because look at how mentally ill these people are. And then there's also, on the other hand, the left wingers are more likely to be like, you're right, I am mentally ill, and I need benefits, and I need you to make sort of like adjustments to society to sort of accommodate my mental illness. And then the problem then is the right wingers will say, if you can't adapt, it's like Darwin, law of the jungle, you're just gonna die. You have this cold, brutal world, and you're just gonna have to die because we don't act, and this is the funny thing, is that the right wingers are supposed to be more religious though, right? And if you follow the teachings of Jesus Christ is actually more of a left winger in this respect, that like Christian teachings are more like to, even if the leftists have completely fragmented themselves into a state of illness and disharmony, they've become like the lepers, right? And it's like Jesus didn't hang out with the people who think that they had all had it all right. He went to the people that were the sinners, right? So there's this Christian attitude that actually, if the leftists are really fucked up, if they're really ill, that just means the reason why we need a leftist Christianity, right? To basically, and because there's a dire need in terms of the social ills that have gone, and like the leftists just like they don't sit on a high horse saying that like we're the healthy bastion of society. They're more likely to say like, I have anxiety, I have depression, I have ADHD, I am autistic, and I need all this stuff, and I need a state apparatus, right, to deliver all this to me in the form of like government funded social services, because I'm just completely fucked. So there's this kind of tendency for the right wingers not to like that, right? That the right wingers are just like, so where are you going to pay for this, right? Which brings me to the astrology, right? What we're dealing with Jupiter in Gemini and Saturn in Pisces, there's a certain kind of social fragmentation going on where that for from a certain perspective, this fragmentation is associated with being ill. Well, I mean, that's because, I mean, wholeness is apparently being whole, right? Wholeness means a return to wholeness. Illness means the descent into fragmentation associated with petty egoism, narcissistic self-interest, and atomizing communities that break down through a process of atomization of narcissism, of petty differences, and squabbling, and people being opinionated, that is in contrast to sublimating the ego to a despotic authority figure who is be seen as your daddy, basically, who's gonna solve all the problems and gonna like make America great again or whatever. You know, the thing is, like, if you go too hard in the other direction, it starts to be bad for a different reason. So I don't mean to say like that's why I'm kind of questionable. I think, or like the figures who end up being the despotic patriarchs are obviously not representations of wholeness or integrity. They just highlight the fact that something's wrong, right? And so I think that should be a given that I don't support that kind of thing, right? So I'm just letting it rip, basically, today. The point is that there's this question: how are we going to pay for all this stuff? The illness and the idea of like the demand on society or the state or whatever for compensation or whatever versus being entitled or whatever and having to like pay back a debt to society, right? Even like it all goes with this thing of Jupiter and Gemini and Saturn and Pisces. And I'll give you the reason why. It goes back to Hellenistic astrology, and this is always an issue, but this is why it's a particular resonance at this moment, is because from the perspective of Hellenistic astrology, you've got the opening square between Saturn and Jupiter, it's like the beginning of this was in 2020 when you had the grand conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. You had the opening square where we are at now, right? And if you think about it, so these two planets have to do a journey, a cycle, right? And we are at the first quarter of this cycle, right? So it's like you're running a marathon and you have done the first quarter of the marathon. And if you, at this point, you're going to like say, how much have we done with this Jupiter-Saturn shit so far since COVID? We've done one quarter, which meaning we got to do 3 more quarters of this to get back to get to the next Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. We got a hell of a lot of work to do, basically, right? And the idea is that Saturn in this position is in the overcoming square to Jupiter, because Jupiter has to go quite a... If we were in, the opposition, we'd be halfway there. We're halfway there. The job is half done. It's a different... It's like, that's also the full moon is like the halfway there of a lunar cycle. A full moon, it's like, you can see it as the coming to completion of like, 100%. The moon is now 100% full, right? Or else you could see it as being like, the moon is 100% full, but it's only halfway through before we get back home to start a new cycle, right? So it's like, we're at this point where we're like, the opposition between Jupiter and Saturn will be like a culmination of the karma that has been started with the, either around the time of the COVID and all this stuff going on with like governments and globalization and corporations and all this kind of stuff. But then it will be a kind of a waning, and then it'll be kind of another reset when we get Jupiter Saturn, and there's about 20 years, right? The whole thing is about a 20-year cycle, right? And so the point is that the Hellenistic astrologers of ancient times used this idea of the opening square, the overcoming square, as being decimating. That Saturn was decimating Jupiter, and this was seen as an army having 10% of its men killed, having its numbers reduced by 10% is also related to taxes, of having you have a certain amount of money and your taxes are reduced by, let's say sales taxes like 10%, or like the idea that I have this house that belongs to my family, but there are taxes that my mom is so old she's doing tax deferral, but if my mom dies, I won't be able to do tax deferral because I'm not that old. So I'm going to have to pay some taxes. Or else, there's also debt, right? How we have a credit economy, how there's all these people that basically have to pay off debts. There's this idea that you could be driving a car, and it's your car, you're an individual, you're an autonomous person, but your car is something that you only own a fraction of because you are borrowing, again, you're taking out a loan or whatever, you're having a lease that you pay off on your car. So it's really the bank owns your car, and or that there's this kind of thing that your car, the ownership of your vehicle is divided, right? It's not something that you just own entirely. It's not so there's this kind of sense that a debt society has our finances in a perpetual state of being divided to these different creditors and lenders or government state apparatuses which demand taxes. And one of the whole political dichotomies generally tends to be that there are people, usually on the right, that don't want to pay taxes, or that conservative parties, right-wing politics, since the time of the Reagan, Thatcher, neoliberal era, has been generally had this idea of just trying to pitch low taxes, and that's the best they can do, right? The idea that a conservative government is meaning a efficient government, that you don't pay too many employees, you don't have too many government services, and you rely on the individuality, the autonomy of individuals to take care of themselves, to make money, to do their own thing, to support themselves, to rely on minimal support from the government. And the same thing, that the people are doing all this stuff on their own good efforts as individuals, that they don't want to pay taxes to the government because it's like having your own individual stash, your own individual share divided up for the sake of doing things like building roads or hospitals or public school. And there's a certain basically disdain on all of that because, like, obviously, you want to have roads to drive on, so to some extent you're going to need to do it. You want to have, like in Calgary, you need to pay for the water, right? You need, like, you're going to have an infrastructure which supports your society. Like, you're going to have water, you're going to have internet, you're going to have heating. But the thing is, like, with internet's interesting because you have corporations which used to be state-owned, which are private. But, like, where I live, there's one monolithic corporation that apparently has competition. But if you take if you take a national telephone company and then privatize it, and then the company that used to be the one in charge of this whole national infrastructure is like this monolith that is like somehow private and it has a monopoly, and it's like you apparently have the choice to spend your money elsewhere, but it's basically just this big or like the same thing could be like, you can have these corporations which are these behemoth monopolies like Walmart, and there's this implication that you have the freedom of choice, that you could shop anywhere, but it just so happens that this one company is like the predator of the jungle that is like going to eat all the other ones whether you like it or not, because they've just worked out a better way of doing things, right? There's certain things that these people, because they have been able to do better, they deserve to be the predators of the jungle, because that's only fair. They deserve to eat all the competition, and they don't want to pay money to taxes, to support people that are ill health. They basically just want to kill them, right? And this is the problem that I identify as a kind of neoliberal fascism, which is a kind of a liberalism which is like minimal government, and we're going to have entrepreneurs, and they're all going to do good for themselves and make lots of money and not rely on the system. But the fascism is like, if we can't do that, it's social Darwinism and we need to kill them, right? And my argument, or I'm kind of going in this direction of that there's a conservative thing that is all about just trying to save money and lower taxes and all this kind of stuff. But there is a opportunity for the whole thing about how the right-wing people are more likely to surrender the ego to the guru in India as a patriarchal... I mean, you don't have to be patriarchal about it, right? This is the whole point. The leftists don't like this because it's like surrendering to a patriarchal authority figure, which you see as a despot or like some sort of cult leader or like Adolf Hitler, a charismatic, tyrant or something like that. They're paranoid against that, right? So, but there's this thing that like if the moral center is, instead of being a bunch of Nazis who want to throw you into the incinerator, is instead, you're surrendering your own self-interest, being a selfish prick, right, to the greater good, being like, to be like, there's some benefit for the good of all, that I'm part of something that is called, and there's a problem because I don't really like nationalism, right? I tend not to be very patriotic, but there's something about like to nationalize, having national industries rather than private industries, and then having I don't think there's like having the main problem is that if you are just having a bunch of individuals who don't pay taxes or pay as little taxes as possible, who don't feel any responsibility to the world around them, then basically essentially you have fragmentation, the fragmentation of society, of having essentially, it's like there's a right-wing tendency to glorify the aristocracy of the noble families and all this kind of stuff, but it's like what you essentially have is a bunch of people that are out for their own self-interests, competing with other people for their own self-interests, and the strong survive out of the competitive competition of the jungle. But there's no basic, there's no common good that you can just trust that these people are going to get along without just viciously stabbing each other in the back in a Machiavellian battle for power and domination. And this is what tends to happen within monarchies. Like, it's not just like a king that is, or like a stable structure. There could be all sorts of like betrayals and things that make for interesting HBO series, HBO drama series where, the throne has been usurped by the, this is why Game of Thrones is cool, because it takes this whole thing about having a kind of like a J.R.R. Tolkien kind of like like a fairy tale idealism to what the monarchy and the kingdom is like, and it's really, these people are actually just a bunch of bastards who are trying to kill each other, and they have a balance of power negotiated, but like the people that you take to be your friends might just fucking turn around and kill you, basically, right? And the idea is that it's like, what you want to do is you want there to be a sublimate, like, take the one that is like a Machiavellian, that's out for his own self-interest, fuck everybody else, I don't know anybody else, anything, is a kind of a toxic dynamic, and that like maybe there is some way to have a benevolent society where people that we can sort of like, care, like that kind of hyper competitive, like to having a feudal capitalism where it's basically like corporations are now these sort of like Game of Thrones families that are basically just out to kill each other, and we have the pretense of democracy as just a kind of a social nicety so that we don't like have the Coca-Cola death squads at your door trying to murder you, right? Like that is basically the problem, and the I don't know. This has just basically been, I'm not really sure if this, like, to me, I feel this goes with the dynamic between Jupiter and Pisces, Jupiter in Gemini squaring Saturn in Pisces, and the problem around social obligation, fragmentation and atomization in society, the changes happening in our culture since COVID, the loneliness and isolation dynamic, and how that plays into political radicalization and fringe ideologies, as well as the return of our kind of archaic feudalism And there's something I wanted to get into, which is like the question is astrology, is the temptation to, like, astrology has this thing built into it of like Saturn is taxing Jupiter and decimating him and taxing him, and we are going to like take the same thing that we're going to take your money and we're going to see what slice of it belongs to the bank, which slice of it we're going to take for the government. Everybody is just going to take your stuff. The same way astrology takes something which is the individual and says, okay, well, you are now this much, you're divided into a Sagittarius, you're divided into a Gemini, you're divided into all these different signs, and that we're going to make these, take a unified whole and slice it into 12, and then we're going to like see, as soon as one thing crosses this sort of arbitrary boundary from one sign to another, it's a totally different ball game, because we're living in a thing which has this sort of like the same way though that like you could fall into a different tax bracket, right? You could be like, I'm a lower income person and I live at a certain dynamic, and then there's a certain arbitrary number where you cross a certain threshold, and all of a sudden it's a totally different story. Like you're in a certain completely different economic situation, right? Just because of how you're doing your taxes, or like how you're making money, and where you fit into the social strata, and how that's afforded to by a system, and whether or not the people around you have a friendly attitude to accommodate you, or whether you are paranoid that there may be like, everybody's become fascist and they give you dirty looks on the street, because they'll just fucking throw you into an incinerator if they had the chance, right? Because like, do you trust people, or are they are we paranoid and hyper vigilant against our community because we are so socially isolated and don't know any people? You're worried that everybody who drives a pickup truck is going to be like a KKK guy who's going to kill you? Or is there some way to get beyond those kind of social fears and be having a sense of belonging in a community where you don't feel like you're hated by everybody around you, right? And that the tendency for left-wing people to be more socially aware of this, and to like admit that they're mentally ill, and admit that, but they'll also be afraid that people are going to want to kill them, or basically see them as a parasitic waste that sucks the lifeblood of society, and for that reason, the need to basically withdraw into further states of hyper-associative schizophrenia, and creating that the only way out of that is to create desperate forms of content creation, to send out into the internet like a message in the bottle, to build parasocial networks in lieu of healthy social dynamics, in the hope that maybe at some point in time a community may start to form out of this kind of like primitive fungal mold, and new forms of social interaction can emerge that are not limited to the archaic structures of the past. That's kind of where I'm going with this. So thanks for watching. I've really just been letting it rip without trying to getting into some stuff that's been on my mind. Thank you for watching. Okay.